Inside the Supreme Court, silence sits heavy, like the air before a storm. Marble echoes carry the smallest movements, a pen click, a throat clear, a heartbeat amplified by anticipation. At the center of it all sits Jasmine Crockett, her hands folded neatly, her posture unshaken. Across from her, Justice Samuel Alito leans forward, eyes narrowed, voice clipped with authority sharpened by years of being obeyed. "Counselor," he says, slicing through her words mid-sentence. "You're drifting from the point." The words hang cold and final. Crockett's eyes lift slowly toward him, unflinching. Her tone had been steady, factual, measured. But his interruption lands with the weight of history. A man of power cutting off a woman of reason. A robed symbol of tradition facing a voice born of change. The gallery stirs. A rustle of disapproval, a few quiet exhales. Cameras capture the moment the way his jaw tightens, the way she doesn't flinch. He interrupts again, then again. Each time his tone grows sharper, more impatient, less judicial, and more personal. "Justice Alito," she says softly, the words almost lost in the tension. "If I may, you've said enough." The silence that follows is electric. Even the marble seems to listen. Crockett lowers her gaze, not in submission but in calculation. A pause long enough to remind him and everyone watching that control is not the same as power. The narrator's voice cuts in, low and deliberate. He thought his title gave him the last word. He was wrong. The screen flickers and the present dissolves. The courtroom fades into fragments of news clips, sound bites, and flashes of protest signs. A rewind hum rises beneath the score, time pulling backward through tension and headlines. 48 hours earlier, Washington still slept uneasy under the weight of questions about ethics, justice, and who gets to define truth. And while the cameras were already being tested, and microphones already humming to life, something else was building for a moment. No one could script, but everyone would remember. The score softens, a heartbeat beneath narration. But what led to that courtroom gasp began long before the cameras started rolling. 2 days before the confrontation, Washington buzzed with the tension of an empire questioning its own reflection. The marble halls of power echoed with whispers not of law, but of loyalty. Headlines pulsed with unease. Ethics under fire, trust in the court plummets. The Supreme Court, once draped in reverence, now stood beneath a shadow of its own making. Justice Samuel Alito had become the quiet face of that discomfort. The man who spoke of impartiality, while his every ruling drew lines between privilege and people. His defenders called him principled. His critics called him untouchable. But in every echoing chamber of authority, there comes a sound that authority cannot silence. Accountability. Enter Jasmine Crockett. The Texas congresswoman who spoke like the storm after the drought was deliberate, cleansing, impossible to ignore. She had earned a reputation in the House not through volume, but through precision. When others shouted, she listened. When they postured, she dissected. Her rise wasn't the product of spectacle, but of something rarer in Washington. Truth without apology. Clips of her past moments flash in montage. Her questioning of a witness who tried to dodge accountability, her quiet smile, before a rhetorical strike that left her opponent speechless. Commentators had coined it the Crockett calm, the signature composure that made truth sting harder than anger ever could. The narrator's tone sharpens. She didn't come to argue for attention. She came to argue for the Constitution, the part that says power belongs to the people, not the privileged. Her presence in the Supreme Court wasn't a coincidence. It was historic. She had filed an amicus brief challenging procedural bias in representation in a case that, at its core, asked a simple but seismic question. Who gets to be heard in the halls of power? That question hung heavier than any gavel, because outside those marble steps, America itself was arguing the same thing. In classrooms, in protests, in living rooms divided by news channels, people were asking whether justice still served everyone, or only those who could afford it. The camera drifts through scenes of citizens watching the hearings from screens of an immigrant mother wiping her hands on an apron as she listens, a law student taking notes with trembling excitement. A retired factory worker nodded quietly at Crockett's name. She had become something symbolic, the voice that made the system listen, if only for a moment. And across that divide sat Alito, the embodiment of the institution that once seemed untouchable. To him, this hearing was a procedure. To her, it was principle. The narrator's voice lowers, heavy with resonance. It wasn't just a question of law. It was a question of who gets to speak and who gets silenced. For Crockett, it was more than professional duty. It was generational inheritance, the continuation of every voice that had been told to wait its turn, to lower its tone, to be grateful for inclusion. She had studied those silences. Now she had come to confront one. In the green room before the hearing, aides whispered strategy. She simply adjusted her notes, took a breath, and said, "If the truth offends power, then let power be offended." The narrator lingers on her words as the screen fades to black, placed by the echo of a gavel. And when old power feels threatened, it doesn't debate. It interrupts. For decades, Samuel Alito had moved through the corridors of American power like a man convinced the walls themselves owed him silence. His rise was not meteoric but methodical, the kind that comes from years of obedience to an institution that rewards certainty more than curiosity. To his supporters, he was the steady hand of conservatism. To his critics, he was the voice of a past that refused to admit it was fading. In the beginning, there was restraint, a careful smile, the practiced neutrality of a man who had mastered the art of appearing calm while keeping control. But beneath the surface of every ruling, every phrase laced with judicial confidence, lay something unspoken, the belief that authority itself was virtue. Old hearings flicker in grainy replay. A female attorney at the podium pauses mid-sentence as Alito's brow furrows. He interrupts softly at first, then with a tone that makes her second-guess her footing. In another clip, a civil rights advocate cites precedent. Alito leans back, smirks faintly, then asks a question that sounds more like an accusation. The record shows reasoned debate. The tone reveals quiet disdain. He called it decorum. Others called it dismissal. The narrator's voice threads through these scenes like a slow verdict. He believed silence was respect. But sometimes silence is submission. That belief had shaped his years on the bench, a conviction that civility meant never being challenged, that respect was owed to rank, not earned through integrity. It was the philosophy of a man who had never truly interrupted himself. When he wrote, his words carried the cadence of certainty. His opinions are often draped in legal eloquence, yet heavy with implication. Time and again, the powerful felt protected, while the vulnerable were told patience was progress. In rulings that touched on workers, on women, on equality, there lingered a quiet message. The law, in his hands, was not a shield for the powerless. It was a mirror for the powerful. Those who clerked for him describe his wit as sharp, his temper restrained but visible in the tightening of his jaw. He valued order above all. Questioning his logic was tolerated, but questioning his perspective was not. To him, authority was not to be debated. It was to be understood his way. In the press, Alito became known for his unshakable composure, his refusal to bend to public opinion. When protests filled the steps outside the court, he barely blinked. When faith in the judiciary dipped to record lows, he shrugged it off as uninformed criticism. His version of justice was fixed, immovable, sanctified by tradition, yet tradition, when never examined, begins to rot beneath its polish. The narrator slows, voice measured, nearly mournful. He saw the challenge as disrespectful. He saw reform as chaos. And in mistaking comfort for conviction, he built a throne instead of a bench. Even among his colleagues, whispers grew. They spoke of a justice who carried his ideology like armor, and who bristled when anyone suggested that armor had cracks. He would smile thinly, adjust his robe, and let silence end the exchange. It was a silence that felt less like peace and more like punishment. To those outside, his decisions became case studies in contrast, written in language that sounded fair, yet tilted quietly toward privilege. Behind every paragraph of impartial phrasing, there was the pulse of belief that hierarchy was natural, that deference was due, that the world worked best when the same voices kept speaking. That was his comfort, the predictable rhythm of reverence. He had spent his life being addressed as Your Honor, and in time the phrase ceased to sound like respect. It sounded like routine. The camera lingers on his face in a dimly lit corridor, a man surrounded by portraits of justices past, their gazes stern and familiar. To him, this was legacy. To history, it was inertia. The narrator sharpens, tone hardening like marble under chisel. For years, he mistook control for clarity. But control is only clear until someone dares to speak through it. And that moment was coming, a test his authority had never faced. Not from defiance, not from rage, but from composure too unyielding to be ignored. The story pauses on his reflection in the courtroom glass robe immaculate, expression certain, unaware that certainty itself was his weakness. But that illusion was about to crack under the calm of one unshakable woman. Jasmine Crockett's story begins not in the marble halls of Washington, but in the quiet, unassuming streets of Dallas, Texas. She was raised in a household where resilience was a daily lesson, and integrity was modeled more than it was preached. Her parents, working long hours in public service and community organizations, instilled in her an understanding that the voices often ignored were precisely the ones that mattered most. From an early age, Crockett learned to listen before speaking, to weigh every word, and to understand that true strength often reveals itself not in volume, but in consistency and clarity. Her education became both armor and instrument. Law school was not simply a pursuit of a career, it was a calling. She immersed herself in constitutional studies, civil rights law, and advocacy, driven by a belief that the legal system could either serve the powerful or protect the vulnerable. She sought out mentors who challenged her thinking, professors who demanded rigor, and internships that exposed her to both the brilliance and the failings of the justice system. Every case, every lecture, every late-night research session shaped a woman who understood the law not as abstract rules, but as living instruments of fairness. In the early days of her career, Crockett often found herself standing alone in courtrooms where doubt and dismissive glances followed her every move. She faced judges who underestimated her, attorneys who questioned her competence, and colleagues who assumed she lacked the gravitas to command authority. Yet she never faltered. Every interruption, every skeptical remark, every door closed in her face became a lesson, a reminder that poise under pressure was as critical as intellect. The narrator's voice threads through these moments with quiet reverence. Every interruption she'd ever faced only taught her how to finish stronger. Her tenure as a public servant deepened her connection to the people she represented. Crockett championed causes that often went unnoticed: immigrant rights, educational equity, and reform in systems that marginalized the most vulnerable. She carried stories of communities long silenced, translating their struggles into policies, speeches, and courtroom arguments that could not be ignored. Her advocacy was meticulous, her presence unwavering, and her rhetoric precise. She did not raise her voice to dominate. She raised it to clarify, to illuminate, and to empower. Flashbacks to her courtroom days show her standing tall under intense scrutiny. A judge cuts her off mid-argument. She pauses, smiles faintly, and returns with a clarity that reframes the entire discussion. Opponents attempt to undermine her with interruptions and dismissive comments. She remains calm, letting logic and evidence carry the weight of her rebuttals. Her reputation grows quietly but resolutely as an emerging authority defined by intellect, empathy, and unshakable composure. Her peers and constituents alike begin to recognize a new form of leadership, one that relies not on theatrics or aggression, but on authenticity and moral courage. Crockett embodies a style of power that is different from the old hierarchies she confronts. It is measured, grounded in principles that transcend politics. She commands respect because she is credible, consistent, and unyielding in her commitment to justice. Even her critics admit the same. She possesses an uncommon ability to diffuse tension while asserting her position with unmistakable authority. Each challenge she faces in court, each policy debate she engages in, each barrier she encounters only sharpens her capacity for discernment and strategic precision. Her calmness is not passivity, it is preparation. Her patience is not inaction, it is anticipation. And every instance of being silenced, underestimated, or interrupted becomes another layer of armor tempered by empathy, intellect, and unwavering dedication to justice. The narrator reflects on the significance of her journey. She represents something new, not anger, but authority born of truth. Not confrontation for its own sake, but courage defined by clarity and conviction. She is the voice for those who have too often been told theirs doesn't matter. Her life and career have led to this moment, a courtroom in Washington, D.C., where history, precedent, and moral courage converge. Jasmine Crockett is not simply entering a hearing. She is carrying decades of preparation, years of advocacy, and the silent prayers of communities who have been forced to wait their turn to be heard. She stands ready, not reactive, not defensive, but fully aware that the weight of interruption is nothing compared to the strength of her truth. The narration lingers, heavy with anticipation, and when Justice Alito tried to silence her, he didn't realize he was awakening her calmest storm yet. The courtroom hummed with quiet expectation as Jasmine Crockett began her argument. Her voice measured and deliberate, each word chosen with precision. She laid out the constitutional principles at stake, framing her points not as attacks but as clarifications, as illuminations of law that demanded attention. The audience, both in the gallery and beyond the cameras, leaned in, sensing the weight of the moment. At first, Justice Alito listened with the composure expected of a jurist. His eyes narrowed slightly, but there was a rhythm to his presence, a practiced patience, a controlled demeanor. Crockett's argument, piercing yet grounded, flowed steadily. She referenced precedent, logic, and principle in a way that demanded acknowledgement, not applause. Then the first interruption came. A clipped remark, dismissive in tone. "Counselor, you are straying from the issue." Crockett paused, her gaze steady, then continued, as if the interruption were nothing more than an audible ripple in the room. The second interruption followed, sharper this time, carrying a subtle edge of impatience. She stopped briefly, breathing evenly, her calm unbroken. The gallery shifted in their seats, murmurs subdued but palpable. Viewers at home sensed the tension rising, the quiet friction between authority and reason. As Crockett pressed forward, Alito interrupted again and then again, each intrusion more transparent in its purpose. It was no longer about law, about debate, it was about dominance. 8 interruptions in total, each one a thinly veiled attempt to unsettle her, to assert power where it did not belong. Yet Crockett's response was not to falter, but to anchor herself further. The narrator emphasizes the quiet power in her demeanor. Every time he cut her off, she smiled a little calmer, because she knew he was losing control. With each pause, each suppressed glare, Alito's composure subtly shifted. His interruptions became less incisive and more frantic, his patience thinning under the weight of Crockett's calm, unwavering presence. The courtroom could feel the imbalance. What was once a structured hearing had become a theater of tension. The subtle battle between tradition and principle, arrogance and dignity, unfolding before witnesses and cameras alike. Crockett's logic was unassailable, her evidence precise, her tone steady. She did not raise her voice, she did not escalate her words. The authority she commanded emanated from mastery of the subject and the quiet certainty of truth. Every interruption he attempted was met with the same unwavering composure, until it became evident that it was not she who was off balance, but he. The gallery noticed. Reporters, clerks, and observers caught the subtle shifts in posture, the tightening of hands, the flicker of doubt in eyes that were accustomed to unquestioned control. Outside, those watching on live streams felt the tension of discomfort, anticipation, a sense that something monumental was brewing. Time seemed to slow as Crockett paused before her next point. The silence was heavy, almost tactile, a canvas upon which the next words would land with impact. Alito for the first time seemed to realize that authority alone could not dominate reason. The audience, sensing the pivotal moment, held its collective breath. Narration hovers over the scene, heightening the suspense. The room waited. Every mind focused. Every eye is fixed. And when she finally spoke, the silence afterward said more than any gavel ever could. The courtroom fell into a hush so complete it felt almost tangible, a heavy stillness that pressed against the walls and marble benches. Jasmine Crockett lifted her gaze, letting it sweep slowly across the room, pausing ever so slightly on the faces of the gallery, the reporters, the clerks, and finally landing on Justice Alito. There was no anger in her eyes, no flare of indignation, only the quiet certainty of someone who had rehearsed this moment not in spectacle, but in principle. Her voice, when it came, was soft yet firm, deliberate in cadence, a measured contrast to the clatter of interruptions that had preceded it. "With all due respect, Justice Alito," she said, each syllable clear, deliberate, and weighty. "Interruptions don't erase truth. They only delay it." The effect was immediate. A ripple passed through the room, subtle yet undeniable. Reporters leaned forward instinctively, pens hovering over notebooks. The gallery, so long accustomed to observing the authority of the robed figures, now sat captivated by the calm gravity of one voice that refused to be silenced. Crockett's argument, structured with precision and delivered with the patience of a master, began to unfold like poetry, legal language imbued with rhythm, moral force, and human resonance. She traced the path from principle to practice, invoking the constitutional guarantee of equality before the law. But she did so not abstractly, not as a distant observer, but rooted in the tangible experience of those who had too often been denied a voice. Every word she spoke connected the theoretical to the lived reality. The immigrant forced to navigate bureaucracy alone, the student overlooked by systemic prejudice, the citizen whose rights were debated as if they were optional. Her voice never rose in anger. Yet each point landed with undeniable force. Each argument dismantled the veneer of arrogance she had faced. Each sentence peeled back the illusion that authority alone could enforce obedience. The camera lingered on Alito, capturing the micro-expressions. The blink, the twitch at the corner of his mouth, the subtle shift in posture, the interruptions, the attempts at dominance, the years of institutional weight, all were failing to suppress her presence. The narrator's voice, slow and resonant, threads through the courtroom. In that instant, the hierarchy inverted. The robe didn't command the respect her truth did. Her words wove seamlessly between principle and personal accountability. She spoke of justice as more than precedent. It was the lived affirmation that integrity, courage, and moral clarity mattered more than rank, more than tradition, more than the quiet intimidation of a single powerful voice. With each pause, each carefully measured phrase, she allowed the audience to feel the gravity of what she was articulating. The murmurs in the room began to ripple outward, not disrespect but recognition. Journalists glanced at each other, eyes wide, pens scribbling, notating a moment that felt historic even as it unfolded. Observers beyond the gallery leaned into the screens, sensing that civility could carry more force than shouting, that calm reason could dismantle arrogance with surgical precision. Crockett's composure was the central force of the scene. She did not need theatrics. She did not need a raised voice or gesturing hands. Her power lay in the confidence of someone whose preparation, intellect, and moral clarity had been tested countless times. Each pause became a punctuation mark, each sentence a strike not at a person, but at the pretense that authority equaled justice. And then, after the final thread of argument, she paused. The room, attuned to her rhythm, waited, silence stretched like taut wire, every eye in the courtroom fixed on her. Even Alito, so long the symbol of control, sat still, his usual composure strained, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. Then came the line that would be remembered, whispered, and quoted for months to come. She spoke softly, almost as if sharing a private truth in the midst of the world. Power means nothing if it can't listen. The words landed like a gavel, not a command but a revelation. The room collectively inhaled, and for a heartbeat it felt as though time itself had paused. The courtroom was still, yet vibrantly alive with the resonance of principle over posture. Reporters' pens moved faster. Clerks exchanged subtle nods in the gallery. Long trained to honor titles, absorbed something far rarer, humility earned in the presence of truth. Narration rises, cinematic and deliberate, and what happened after that no one could have scripted. It was the moment when composure became confrontation, when calm authority became an unstoppable force. The silence was not emptiness, it was acknowledgement. Every interruption, every attempt to dominate, had been rendered powerless not by retaliation, but by the quiet, deliberate power of one voice speaking what could not be ignored. Even the cameras seemed to hold their breath. In that courtroom, in that instant, the moral ledger had been recalibrated, not by gavel or precedent alone, but by clarity, courage, and unshakable principle. Crockett had not merely argued, she had transformed the very air of the room into testimony of what dignity in action looks like, what it means to speak truth to power without compromise. Her statement reverberated beyond the walls of the court. It was poised to echo in conversations, in media coverage, in classrooms, in living rooms. A single line, soft yet decisive, had demonstrated that the greatest authority is not inherited. It is claimed through integrity, knowledge, and courage. And in that charged silence, the world realized something extraordinary. The hierarchy had shifted. The narrative had changed, and the calmest storm had become unstoppable. Within hours, the moment had escaped the marble walls of the Supreme Court and begun its unstoppable journey across the digital world. Hashtags ignited like wildfire. Crockett Truth surged on Twitter, retweeted by thousands within minutes, debated by pundits, celebrated by students, activists, and ordinary citizens alike. Clips of her measured tone, her piercing logic, and that final line, "Power means nothing if it can't listen," circulated endlessly, edited into compilations, GIFs, and TikTok short-form reenactments. The media couldn't look away. Late-night monologues dissected the scene frame by frame, praising not just the substance of her argument, but the poise with which she delivered it. One commentator called it the calmest obliteration in courtroom history, a phrase that quickly became shorthand for a new standard of discourse. Even critics who disagreed with her conclusions acknowledged the force of her presence, the clarity of her voice, and the undeniable moral authority she displayed. Across international news networks, headlines framed the encounter as "the moment decorum met democracy." Commentaries explored the deeper symbolism, a younger generation reclaiming space in the corridors of entrenched power, a woman unafraid to assert both intellect and dignity, a reminder that authority must earn respect rather than demand it. The story was no longer just about one hearing. It became a narrative of systemic reflection, challenging viewers worldwide to reconsider who gets to speak and who is expected to listen. The narrator's voice overlays the montage, slow, resonant, cinematic. It wasn't her tone that shook the court, it was her control. In classrooms and living rooms across the country, people paused the footage to absorb the precision of her delivery, the calmness under pressure that contrasted sharply with the interruptions and impatience she faced. Social media lit up with interpretations, reaction videos, and heartfelt reflections from ordinary citizens. An immigrant mother acknowledging the validation of finally being represented, a law student inspired to pursue advocacy, a young activist reminded that dignity and intellect could be more formidable than anger or volume. Even within political commentary circles, analysts debated the implications. Some described it as a turning point in how public figures could confront entrenched authority without losing decorum. Others framed it as a cautionary tale. Power unchecked, when confronted by intellect grounded in principle, can falter. The viral wave did not just celebrate Crockett. It amplified a moral lesson, demonstrating that the most enduring victories are those rooted in consistency, preparation, and ethical courage. Beyond the digital realm, her colleagues and constituents responded with awe and pride. Messages flooded her office, expressing admiration not only for the argument itself, but for the manner in which it was presented. She became a symbol for those who had long been told to wait their turn, to lower their voices, to compromise their integrity to accommodate the discomfort of others. Crockett's composure and clarity reminded them that true authority lies not in silencing opposition, but in earning trust through respect, preparation, and empathy. The courtroom itself became mythologized. Observers replayed the moments, noting subtle shifts in body language, the twitch of Alito's jaw, the pause before he could formulate another interruption, the way Crockett's calmness seemed to absorb and deflect the tension around her. The entire sequence became a masterclass in restraint and strategic authority, a living example for those studying law, governance, and leadership. Cultural commentators reflected on the generational implications. Here was a figure who represented change without spectacle, discipline without aggression, and intellect married to empathy. In a world dominated by performative outrage, her measured voice reminded people that impact comes not from volume, but from clarity, courage, and moral coherence. The narrator circles the moment with a sweeping perspective. One composed woman had reignited a conversation about respect and power. The ripple extended far beyond the marble steps into homes, classrooms, and hearts across the nation. It wasn't the outrage she provoked that mattered. It was the integrity she embodied. And yet, even amidst the virality, the hashtags, the debates, and the social media accolades, there lingered a deeper resonance. The moment was electrifying, yes, but it also illuminated the persistent imbalance that had allowed such interruptions to occur in the first place. Crockett's triumph was real, visible, and viral, but it cast light on systemic truths that went unnoticed in the frenzy of online acclaim. The narrator softens, reflective, almost foreboding, but beneath the viral fame lies a deeper truth that America keeps forgetting. The courtroom had emptied, but the weight of the moment lingered far beyond its walls. The echoes of Crockett's voice, calm yet unyielding, reverberated in ways that could not be contained by marble or media. The narrator's tone slows now, reflective, almost meditative, guiding the audience to see beyond the drama and into the principle at stake. This was never about one man, one robe, or one hearing. It was about the question that pulses at the heart of any society that calls itself democratic. Who gets to define respect? Who decides which voices matter and which can be dismissed? Crockett's poise, her precise words, her refusal to be interrupted or diminished, became more than courtroom strategy. They became a metaphor for the enduring power of truth. Her final line, "Power means nothing if it can't listen," resonates now as a broader truth about governance, leadership, and civic responsibility. The statement transcends the immediate clash between lawyer and justice. It speaks to a nation where inclusion too often yields to ego, where dignity is tested against arrogance, and where the loudest voices dominate conversations that require thoughtfulness, reflection, and empathy. Narration threads the moral thread gently but insistently. The loudest voice in the room isn't always the strongest. Sometimes it's the calmest one that rewrites history. Crockett's victory, though quiet and measured, carries lessons for every viewer. That authority is most legitimate when it listens. That leadership is most durable when rooted in integrity. And that influence is greatest when wielded with composure rather than coercion. Her words, her presence, and her meticulous preparation revealed the fundamental truth. Respect is not granted by titles or tradition. It is earned through consistency, courage, and ethical clarity. Beyond the courtroom, the implications unfold. Leaders in every sphere, from local councils to international diplomacy, are reminded that power divorced from attentiveness is fragile. Communities long accustomed to being ignored see in Crockett a reflection of what is possible when advocacy is paired with strategy and dignity. Students and young activists recognize that assertiveness need not sacrifice grace, that standing firm in principle can dismantle centuries of assumed authority without resorting to spectacle. The narrator widens the lens, giving space for reflection and emotional release. In a noisy world, it is easy to mistake volume for victory, but Crockett showed that integrity, preparation, and moral clarity can eclipse even the most entrenched arrogance. She did not just defend a constitutional principle, she reminded the nation what respect really requires. This resolution reframes the confrontation as catalytic rather than conclusive. Crockett is not a lone hero conquering evil. She is proof that one person, rooted in preparation and principle, can shift narratives, inspire dialogue, and challenge assumptions. Her calmness, intellect, and dignity are a template for future leaders, a beacon for those who believe that civility and courage are not mutually exclusive. The moral expands further, tying the moment to enduring values: empathy, equity, and truth. Every interruption she faced, every attempt at dominance, and every observer who witnessed her steadiness contributed to a larger lesson. That society flourishes when voices are heard, when debate is genuine, and when power listens as much as it dictates. The narrator's tone swells gently, cinematic, inviting the audience to internalize the lesson. This moment reminds us that real strength is not measured by control over others, but by the ability to command respect without coercion. That leadership is not possession of authority, but a commitment to uphold justice, dignity, and truth. And finally, the reflection circles back to the gasp that had defined the climax. The narrator leaves the audience with clarity and resonance. And that's why the gasp wasn't fear, it was recognition. Her final line makes the court gasp. Those words, spoken with quiet authority, were more than a moment of courtroom drama. They became a mirror for a nation. The gasp wasn't merely a reaction to one woman's argument. It was the sound of recognition, of a society suddenly reminded that integrity and truth can ripple farther than titles, robes, or tradition. Across the country, from living rooms to lecture halls, from community centers to city streets, her words resonated. They reminded citizens that the principles of justice are not abstract. They are lived, defended, and sometimes demanded by those brave enough to speak clearly, calmly, and without compromise. Her voice became a symbol that dignity, preparation, and courage can command attention, even in the presence of entrenched authority, because when truth speaks, even power listens. This is more than a story of one debate or one courtroom confrontation. It is a call to awareness, a demonstration that courage paired with clarity can shift narratives and challenge assumptions. It is a reminder that every voice matters, and that speaking with integrity can change not just opinions, but the course of conversations, communities, and even history itself. If you believe dignity should never be interrupted, hit subscribe. Because this isn't just commentary, it's justice in action. Let the images linger. Let the echoes of her voice remain in your mind. Fade into the soft orchestral underscoring, the calm triumph of principle over interruption, the quiet restoration of respect, and the sense that history is still being written one unshakable voice at a time.